Players gather, like me, Tana Grace, who's lifetime undefeated against Brian Cook, to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most powerful in the history of Magic the Gathering. Cards like Grief, and more Grief, and sometimes many others. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy in search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind BoshNRoll on YouTube, Thraben University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by 3-for-1 Trading and Sparks Law Practice.
Hello, and welcome to episode 129 of the Eternal Glory podcast, Anti-Grief Meta Contenders. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introductions and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU.
I am Brian Coval, aka BoshNRoll.
And I am Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm.
Shout out to all our new Patreon and YouTube subscribers. Buckle up, because there's a lot of them. We talked a lot of shit in the last pre-show, and I guess people liked it. We've got Gaming with Thunder, Sodas, Matthew B, Gustavo C, Ka L, Ukes, Edward Z, Jose H. Oh, that's half the list. Here we go. Switching to the other page. Jordan K, an anonymous person who asked not to be named. Hamburger Time, Sean C, Volker S, Jason B, Jared R, Cal J, shout out to Cal J, friend of the show, Dank Audio Stash, Michael N, Frank S, Thomas R, Zach W, and Tony P.
Wow.
That's a huge group of new subscribers. Shout out to all of you. You're the real heroes around here.
And there is a very juicy strategic tidbit in the pre-show that I think is worth the price of admission. It blew my mind. Literal hands on head.
Phil did yell when I explained it. It involves a Modern Horizons 3 card.
All right, this episode is brought to you by Sparks Law, a business transactional law firm owned by Eternal Magic community member Jonathan Sparks. If you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or gig worker looking to start your own company, Sparks Law can help with partnership agreements, contract reviews, intellectual property protection, or any other business legal questions. If you want to shape your business strategy with a fellow Eternal gamer, reach out via email to jsparks, that's JSPARKS, at sparkslawpractice.com, or call 470-268-5234. 3-for-1 Trading is one of Europe's leading Magic the Gathering traders. Their online shop has a fantastic selection of high-end Magic cards, especially for vintage, legacy, and old-school players. You can find them at shop.3for1trading.com or visit their booth at major events. They run weekly sales, and new, individually scanned high-end cards are added every Wednesday. Use code ETERNALGLORY to get our community-exclusive offer of free worldwide shipping on your first order over $500 and experience their world-class customer service and exact grading for yourself.
And if you would like to advertise to over 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every single episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors.
Okay, so our episode today, obviously, Grief is still around in Legacy. Nadu is still around in Modern.
Boo.
Yep, and just earlier today, we record these on Tuesdays. It is 7:23, and just today, Blake Rasmussen went on the Wizards daily update thing that he does and said that the next banned and restricted update is August 26th, period. There will not be an emergency ban. The planned date of August 26th is still their planned date of making updates. They said they believe that it's better to stick to the schedule rather than surprising people with random dates. And that is where we're at with Grief and Nadu, both of which he did mention. He specifically said Nadu in Modern, Grief and Legacy, and something about Boros Energy and Historic, whatever the hell that is. But yeah, those things were mentioned by name. So it sounds like they're happening, but they are not happening until August 26th. And that is the final answer from Wizards of the Coast at this time.
So I could get real fired up here.
Do it, Phil. Do it.
All right. This sucks. It fucking sucks. It sucked when we didn't lose Grief and Nadu the first time around, and we entered a lame duck format. The community backlash was absolutely terrible, and then they doubled down on it. The community backlash is, again, absolutely terrible. Like, tournament attendance sucks. Events are getting canceled. Like, people are very much losing faith in constructed formats right now. And since it is problems with constructed across multiple different formats, the usual answer of like, hey, just go and play something else for a little while is not currently a great solution. So like on Friday, I'm dropping a video and the thumbnail is just Legacy is fucked with some asterisks because I can't put swear words in YouTube titles and expect it to do well. And I recorded like an hour-long video just like talking about current Legacy and its problems. And I am a frustrated, highly invested individual who would like to see some change, but I don't get it.
Yep. I paraphrased what Blake said for the purposes of our episode setup here. He did actually have kind of a long, thoughtful explanation of we tried bannings as needed at random intervals, just whenever it was appropriate, we fired it in. We did that for a few years, a little while ago, and it didn't work. And now we are committed to banning on the cycle and doesn't want to pull the rug out from underneath anybody. They talked about how in this particular case, the modern RCQ season is actually going to be running for 4 weeks before August 26th, where action is definitely going to be taken against Nadu and possibly other things. But if you had ordered a deck and tested and done all the work, expecting to be able to play Nadu and use that to qualify for your regional championship for the entire month of August, starting, next weekend, this would be a big rug pull on those people. And obviously, like, we don't want to play against Grief anymore. Nadu's obviously busted in Modern, but also there are people with, financial and planning things on the line here. It is tough to balance, and I am frustrated by it too, but I'm also not surprised or particularly offended by their decision not to make an emergency announcement. So I don't know.
Brian, what pisses me off is that Wizards is the one that sets the schedules, and right after Modern Horizons 3 came out, 2 weeks after, they decided that those cards hadn't had enough time. It's like, okay, well, if 2 weeks isn't enough time, change the schedule. And I know that it's like this crazy concept, but you make the rules and then don't like the rules afterward. And if that's the problem, you have to make it so that way it can be updated. It was very obvious pre-Modern Horizons 3 that Grief needed to fucking go. Like, everyone was in agreement, but for whatever reasons, Wizards of the Coast did not listen. Even their legacy expert told them, hey, this card needs to go. And then right after the Pro Tour, everyone was like, Nadu needs to leave Modern. And instead of like emergency banning to fix the RCQ season, they're not doing that. So I wonder if there's someone above Blake or above Andrew Brown that's like, hey, for XYZ reason, we can't do that. And if that is the case, I don't know, maybe replace that person. I don't know, but they're clearly not making good decisions for the game. I understand it might be better for the bottom line, but right now constructed Magic is terrible.
So they can make those changes. I don't think it's like Blake who gets to decide. He's just the communications guy over there. But another part of the announcement today was that they are starting to have internal conversations about where they're going to put the BNR updates, because it is important to them to have a steady cadence so nobody gets blown out by just investing in Nadu and then it gets banned the day before your RCQ. I do agree with that, but they were talking about looking at, instead of coinciding with set releases, maybe coinciding with qualifier seasons. Like at the end of each season, do a BNR update rather than after each set is released. And maybe that makes more sense for people to prep for the upcoming season, and we have a full season of information about the cards that were just played with and stuff. So it sounds like they are looking for a better way to do this without reverting to Wild West, check Twitter every Monday, see if anything was banned, because that wasn't great either. So it sounds like they're being thoughtful about it, but the ship moves slowly over there. They do have to think months out or even years out in some cases before they can make changes.
I have an issue with the RCQ timeline being BNR. So RCQs are quarterly. Am I wrong?
I believe that's right.
So now instead of every month or every month and a half-ish, we're moving to every 4 months. So instead of having to wait an extra month and a half for grief, we might be waiting 3 months if we find out that the next thing is a problem. So I think that's actually not a great solution because in some instances, people are waiting a longer time period. I mean, they might get their feet pulled out from under them by buying a $6 Nadu and then having it be banned. But I'd rather the game move at a quicker BNR pace than having lame duck formats and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I sound like an apologist, like I don't give a shit, but I think it is, like you said, they make the rules. Maybe they'll do every set release and the end of every RCQ season and hit it more often. Maybe they'll do we'll check in at the end of every month. I don't know. But they are clearly aware that releasing or only being constrained to set release announcements is not working right now.
So I have a question for you guys while we're talking about bans before we get to the next topic. I've had some people comment on my videos rather than this podcast because I believe all three of us are still in agreement that we don't want a legacy format panel. I had a couple people comment on videos like, have you changed your opinion on a legacy format panel yet? LOL. I still don't want one. If I'm being honest, I just don't think it's a great idea. And I know that we get a lot of those comments on this podcast. I just don't think it's what's best for the legacy format. I trust the people making decisions to ban the right thing. I just wish that they'd be a little more quick about it.
So the big thing that I am worried about here is that we get the grief ban that should have happened a while back with this August BNR update, but nothing else is considered. And then we immediately find out hey, with grief gone, Psychic Frog is too good. Or with grief gone, the Eldrazi deck is too good. And we just kind of immediately enter into another stagnated format where there's still something that is clearly better than everything else. And we go from warped format to boring format. Bloomburrow's not going to introduce everything good. And we just kind of never get players out of that disenfranchised burnout loop, and we lose a lot of people.
I might be the bully here or the one that's in the wrong, but if hypothetically, let's say I have the power to make decisions, I would ban grief and not touch anything else. I don't think that Psychic Frog is actually over the power line yet. I don't think that the Eldrazi deck is over the power line yet. And I also think that banning grief would scale back the frog decks at least a little bit because there's less of a reason to play black. And that opens up your removal because you're not trying to not get double scammed on turn one. So now you have more removal spells. I do think that the frog decks are weak to white cards. However, good luck playing white cards when grief scams in the format. So I think, I could be wrong. In 3 months, I might be like, oh, past Bryant was an idiot. But as of right now, I'd touch grief and nothing else.
So what I'm frustrated about here is grief should have gone previously, so we learn whether or not other things are over the line from MH3 before we hit this next banning window. I am very frustrated about that.
Oh, I agree with you there.
Yeah, absolutely. Grief should have been gone in the last update, probably even the update before that. We are, kind of 2 months, 3 months, 5 months behind natural rotation as we've been under the thumb of big grief for that time. But I made some version of this point in the last pod too. And when we're talking about Legacy, which is the eternal format, it's the one where you could play all the cards, and the historical perspective of Legacy and all the cards you have access to, I understand why Wizards of the Coast would be slow to ban something if maybe it doesn't need to be banned, or why not just give it 2 more months? It fucks up our summer as Legacy players who are hoping to go to SCG Baltimore or the Oklahoma Land Run or this or that event in DC that got canceled because grief wasn't banned. All of these things suck for us, but Wizards of the Coast, they're thinking about, they just released a product that is going to have cards legal in it in standard until 2029. That's the level they're thinking on. That's their scale, where our scale is I want to play Legacy this summer and I want to have fun doing it. I wish, I agree, grief should be gone, but also I can understand being slow rather than fast if you have to pick one or the other. I don't know.
All right. I think before we do the entire episode on this topic, we should actually talk about the format that we have, because something that we have said again and again and again on this podcast is that we are going to play the format that we have, whatever it looks like. So if you are going to fight against Scam, if you are signing up for events, what should you actually be doing right now?
So I kind of have it as resilience and redundancy are the words that come to mind, where what deck doesn't mind getting its best 2 cards blasted out of its hand on turn 1? Who can bounce back from that? And that's kind of where I'm at with what decks are functional right now. And there's like a bunch of different categories of that, and kind of decks whose cards all do the same thing is one of the first ones. That's the redundancy, and that's like Eldrazi, Red Stompy, even Death and Taxes. Like their bullets do different things, but you have so many overlapping effects and the tutors to get them all, and you get kind of the same effect. Do you guys have any other ideas in that, like decks whose cards all do the same thing kind of wheelhouse that would be appropriate for this category?
So traditionally, a deck like Initiative might fit into that category, but Initiative is very close to 0% of the format right now. It's just too easy for the Riscaminator decks to either overpower them or evasively take initiative, or grief you, reanimate your initiative creature on turn 1. So not that one.
I do have a quick note here. I was recording a Storm video earlier today, and I got paired against Red Stompy, and I was like, I should look up a recent list because I haven't been playing. And I looked up a list, and Phil's going to be like, I can't believe you didn't know this, Bryant. But I'm looking at the main deck, 0 Trinisphere. I'm like, hell yeah. Hell yeah. And then I noticed 4 Unlicensed Hers. Well, that says something about the format. You're clearly trying to beat graveyard decks. Okay. I keep skimming. 3 Chalice of the Void. 3. I can't remember a time period in which less than 4 Chalice of the Void was optimal. And the more recent list had 3, which tells me that you might want to draw 1, but you don't want to draw 2. And it says that like 1 mana value spells probably aren't as good as they are right now. And I was really taken aback by that. So to Brian's point, they're fitting in more cards that beat Scam or just do the same thing.
On that note, like Moon Stompy players, maybe consider just cutting the Chalice of the Void and playing Vexing Bauble. That felt really good when I did it. I 5-0'd with it, small sample size and whatnot, but I don't think Chalice is particularly good in Legacy right now.
Yeah, and what Bryant was saying about the prison pieces being largely out of Red Stompy, and now it's just like Broadside Bombardiers, Goblin Rabblemaster, maybe some other 3-drop Goblet or whatever. And it's just like these cards all do the same thing. And it doesn't matter. Like, you're just not giving your opponent the option to grief either your threat or your lock piece, because everything's just a threat. And that is how a deck like that has reacted to the grief metagame.
Otherwise, I like decks that are incredibly redundant. Cephalid Breakfast is a great example of that. That deck used to be a little hard to assemble the combo because like you had 1A and 1B and like maybe some Shukos to mix that up. But now like you have 8 payoff cards, you have 8 to 12 enablers, kind of depending on what you are counting. You can run Delighted Halfling to make your stuff uncounterable. You have other mana dorks. You can play an Urza Saga fair game if you need to. I have been very, very impressed with Legacy Nadu decks as a whole.
Yeah, the Cephalid Breakfast, instead of like 4 Nomad, 1 Shuko, it's now like 1 or 2 Shuko and a bunch of sagas to find the Shuko. And you have 8 things to target with it between the Nadu and the Cephalid. And the Nadu can even flip into interaction plus Cephalid, and then you pivot from drawing cards into comboing off. And having a main deck thing like Nadu that leverages the same engine in the metagame where people are prepared for graveyards because of Scam. Like before Psychic Frog came along, we were just seeing 4 Dothy Voidwalker in the main deck of Scam as the flex slot. Like Bowmaster was out, they hadn't figured out Frog yet, or it wasn't printed yet, and main deck Graveyard Hate. Nadu just gets to juke around that. So the current Bant builds of Nadu Breakfast are really good at just kind of powering through even targeted discard, even though they are a deck that's trying to assemble a contraption. which is the opposite of what we were just talking about.
I don't think that we've covered the decks that just don't care about discard spells, like the lands-based strategies, like Dark Depths, Cloud Post, all of those. Like, those are decks where your key elements can't be discarded. And then the idea is that once the Riskaminator deck hits its mid-game, your mid-game is just more powerful off of the top. Like, okay, you discarded, I don't know, some crop rotation or whatever. At some point, I'm going to draw a Sowing Mycospawn and destroy 2 of your lands while getting a threat that might be able to trade with Grief later. Like, those sort of things I think are really, really interesting right now.
Yeah, cards like Uro or Life from the Loam that you are not only don't mind, but might actually enjoy them being in the graveyard rather than your hand. Those strategies really are solid right now.
Yeah, I want to talk about Sowing Mycospawn more later on in this podcast in our Eldrazi specific section. I think the technology with that card has gotten a lot better.
Yeah, that one's a wild one. And yeah, like Phil alluded to, the entire second half of this episode, we're going to be like really digging in on the Eldrazi deck specifically, because that one is heating up like crazy in the metagame right now.
So I would like to say, so you think of decks that also might like to be discarded, like Dredge or even Rakdos Reanimator. I think that those decks might actually just be traps, even though you think that they might be good against Riskaminator, because so much of the format is graveyard hate trying to beat Riskaminator that I think playing a dedicated graveyard deck like that ends up hurting you more than you might think. Plus, Riskaminator might just reanimate your large threat and make you feel foolish. So really, graveyard-centric decks, I think, are kind of risky at the moment.
Yeah, playing classic Reanimator, I think, is just a death sentence. Just giving them something worth griefing out of your hand. It's like giving them 4 more Entombs in their deck. That's definitely a mistake. I know Mafouche Van Gogh put up a top 8 in a recent challenge with Dredge. That person is out there creating content and updating Dredge like crazy. Maybe they're just a Dredge god, but at least one person is putting up results with Dredge right now. And something that I know, Bryant, you advocate for all the time, like kind of breaking the mold even on established looking combo packages. Mafouche changes Dredge like every month to be significantly different, like actual like no bridge from below this week. This week it's a turn 1 combo deck with the Bear Mom thing, the one that gives like all your 2/2s a cantrip or whatever. Like you literally flip your whole deck when you dread return that thing and really moving stuff around. For a while, he was on a build with Force of Will and Brainstorm, just a kind of mid-range slow blue dredge that eventually pivots into combos. Doing work like that, you can find spots. And I want to clarify, because I felt myself saying it, we are not in a situation where anyone on this pod is advocating, like, you just need to innovate harder, you dopes, because that is something that people say sometimes when a format is sick. And, you know, Grief's got to go. But finding ways to innovate to make whatever percentages you can still viable in this lame duck period is still worth doing, even though, no, we are not going to innovate our way out of Grief being unhealthy.
On a slightly related topic, I recorded with the Nadu Elves deck this week that was somewhat, you know, in the category that we're talking about with resilience and redundancy. Like Green Sun Zenith decks in general, I think tend to be pretty good against the Riskaminator decks just because you have so many creatures that you're able to overwhelm them a little bit, assuming they don't have the turn 1 Entomb into like Archon of Cruelty. Just because like you're able to go wide. And I do think that those decks struggle with going wide, which is why Eldrazi and Red Stompy are so good against them. That said, I think Elves has some other flaws, but Green Sun decks in general, I think, are likely favored against Riskaminator decks. And I'm not talking about like the Newton piles. I recorded like the more classic combo-y Elves piles. I'm well aware that the Newton Elves deck with 4 main deck endurance is pretty good against that deck.
Yeah, and Green Sun Zenith is just a good example of the type of card that creates that redundancy and resilience, because you're not like, I gotta draw my Scavenging Ooze. You're like, I could draw my Scavenging Ooze or any of these 4 Zeniths, and then the Zenith will swoop in for later, which will then become an Endurance or a WinCon or, you know, whatever as you go. And I think the Turbo Nadu decks that are built around Zenith, the stuff that Burnt Taco is putting up a bunch of results with on Magic Online, those decks are very cool. The Newton, you just shouted him out. the Cradle Control, and then like Depths, Maverick, even some like Cloud Post shells that spin up their Reclaimers and bigger stuff as you go up the curve. All those decks are pretty reasonable right now.
Yeah, I really like Green Sun in the Nadu decks. I think that giving you the ability to tutor up a mana ramp like spell, a Cavern of Souls in the form of Delighted Halfling, a protection spell in the form of Sylvan Safekeeper, a random Silver Bullet, or your Nadu all in one card. Like Green Sun eating good right now.
Yeah, it's a good time. Shout out to Dukes on Twitch. #1 Green Sun Zenith lover on Earth.
As the Storm Boy of the chat, I don't like the next category of decks, and those would be the Stifle Knot decks, the Dreadnought decks, just because they play Stifle, and as the Veil of Summer player, I hate that. But they're really, really good at beating Rescaminator, because they have things like Dress Down in the main deck. They have Doorkeeper Thrall. Obviously, you have Stifle This, Stifle and Atraxa Trigger. Those decks are really good at keeping up with the Rescaminator, Demir Temple style shells. And I understand why they're popular at the moment. It makes a lot of sense to me. Brian, you probably played the most of those decks. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I am a low-key Dreadnought lover. I think Phyrexian Dreadnought is behind Titan of Nature's Wrath for winningest card on my entire channel. Like, of posted trophies, I think Dreadnought is number 2. And it has, like, exactly what we were just talking about. All of the things that enable Phyrexian Dreadnought also turn off Grief and Atraxa and Archon of Cruelty on the entry. And normally the entry is the important one. Like, you stifle that Atraxa trigger, then it's just another idiot. You could Swords to Plowshares, or bounce with Caracas, or whatever. Or annihilate it with a Null Drifter. Oh, baby. That's my jam. But it throws back to a couple years ago when Doomsday was just at the top of the format solidly. And Dreadnought decks were low-key insane because everything that puts a Dreadnought into play also stops the Thassa's Oracle. Those are the same type of game effect. And same is true of Grief, same is true of Atraxa. And even just like stifle that Troll of Khazad-dûm cycle off of the turn 1 Wasteland. We know Scam is cheating on basically every axis. They play 16 lands and 4 of them are Wasteland. Stifle that Troll. They won't cast a spell. There's all these little angles where something like that works. And Dreadnought is just a big old boy. If you slow them down even a little bit, it can pop out of an Urza Saga. And guess what? Grief is not winning that race. So there's a lot to like about Dreadnought right now.
I also think that the deck is relatively easy to pilot. Like, it is objectively just kind of powerful, and it lends itself to a decent number of free wins, which is something that I like in a legacy deck. Like, I am not the biggest cantrip enjoyer, but when I have picked up that deck to record with it a handful of times, like, I have always done well with that.
It's very cool. It's very powerful. Someday I will build the courage to actually register it for an event that counts, because I just win with it like crazy every time I play it, but I also can't register it in my head. I can't get it into that tier of decks I'd seriously consider for a tournament level. And I don't know why, because the results are there for me over a long period of time with many different versions. One word of caution, though, if you are going to play Dreadnought, getting your Null Drifter Grief Reanimated. They don't get to draw 2 cards, but giving them a 4/4 Flying Annihilator creature is pretty rough. So have a plan for that. Just be aware that can happen.
Before Rescaminator, there was just like a classic Demir tempo deck, and I think that those decks benefited from looking like Scam, but not actually being Rescaminator. So do we have any thoughts on possibly playing those? Because you could just be like the Psychic Frog Nethergoyf deck nowadays, and then not actually have that Reanimator package and just look like a tempo deck, so that way you get people boarding against you wrong. Like, is this an angle that's worth attacking in the Legacy metagame?
It could be. I've seen people working on shells like that, and Nethergoyf is a pretty real threat. Psychic Frog, like we're going to talk about later in the episode, I believe is genuinely the future of Legacy. Once Grief's gone, Psychic Frog is the next conversation we're going to have. And getting the work done now to figure out how those decks are going to look and how to make them viable, you're going to have a huge leg up in August when Grief is gone. And although it is powerful and the deck has all these interlocking pieces that make pitching a card to Grief early not that big of a deal out of Rescaminator, it is still a deck that's trying to assemble a contraption. It is You need a black card to pitch, you need a grief to cast, you need a reanimate to bring it back, or you need an entomb plus a reanimate. You are trying to get multiple pieces together. It's a high synergy deck while also being a high power deck, where if you are just a Wasteland Daze, Nethergoyf, Psychic Frog, and then spells instead of random black cards to pitch or animate deads that might not have a target, they're just good spells. Maybe you're also a Stifle deck. Maybe you have room for Bowmaster, Frog, and Dothy Voidwalker in some number because you're not trying to fill out your slots with Griefs and Atraxas. Like, there might be a lot to like about a deck like that. And there definitely will be at the end of August.
Putting some numbers on it now, the Grixis Delver deck is roughly 6% of the metagame. The things that are classified as Demir aggro that are not the full-on Reanimator decks are about 4%. So, like, there are very real existing Psychic Frog decks already, and I expect those numbers to go up a lot once Grief goes. I think it is just a very strong thing to be doing.
Agreed. So we have a section, gentlemen, dedicated to Psychic Frog. It's actually at the end of our notes, but do we want to do that now because we're talking about it?
Yeah, let's do it now, and then I'll do my love letter to Eldrazi.
Okay, so I will do my concerned love letter about Psychic Frog now. I have played with and against Psychic Frog a lot lately, and it feels like Dreadhorde Arcanist, except it's harder to kill. We will see if it's over the line or not. Like, I'm not saying this is clearly a Dreadhorde Arcanist brought back, like it's got to go. I am not calling for any bans beyond Grief. Like, we got one job here to deal with that first. But the feeling of opponent sticks a frog, dazes your removal spell, I'm way behind, and it's just going to get worse. That is the Dreadhorde Arcanist play pattern, and it doesn't die to Lightning Bolt, ever. Sometimes it doesn't even die to Unholy Heat. You can never interact with it in combat, and it's going to define what removal spells have to look like in the Legacy format. I genuinely think we might enter an era where Delver does not play Lightning Bolt, or at least not as a 4-of. Because it just doesn't answer the important thing. That we're going to see main deck Pyroblast. We're going to see white and black removal get the nudge, like Molten Collapse, Fatal Push. That's what Grixis Delver is going to be doing. They might have a couple of Lightning Bolts for the reach factor, but if the format's going to coalesce around Psychic Frog, Lightning Bolt stock. It's time to short Lightning Bolt if you're in the betting mood.
I have 2 points to make here. So the first would be, if we're talking about the future of Legacy and Psychic Frog, there's probably Murktide Regent in that equation if you look at the current Grixis Delver decks that are fairly popular. And it's kind of insane how good Psychic Frog is at making your Murktide Regent even bigger, since the give it flying aspect then pumps up your Murktide Regents. We haven't really seen that sort of consistency at increasing your Murktide Regent's power level like we can with this card. My second point is, Brian, you said this card is like Dreadhorde Arcanist. I don't want to be like too hyperbolic, so I haven't been saying that because I understand how it looks being the combo player, calling something like Psychic Frog Dreadhorde Arcanist, because I can't block it. Like, I don't play creatures that block. Like, blockers are for people, I don't want to deal with that. So I feel like it's weird to call it Dreadhorde Arcanist because it's very different in the fact that if you're willing to play lots of creatures, this card is worse. Yes, they can give it flying, but it requires more and more resources, and having played a lot of Modern against Psychic Frog, I have noticed the difference sometimes. So I'm skeptical to call it Dreadhorde Arcanist, but I can see the comparison, and I just want to point it out that, like, low to the ground creature decks, it plays a lot worse than Dreadhorde, just because Dreadhorde, it didn't matter if it was blocked. I just want to point that out.
If you are playing a creature deck, Psychic Frog is better than Dreadhorde Arcanist. Just like full stop. If I am playing some sort of like Eldrazi, Humans deck, Death and Taxes deck, anything that is trying to like do fair creature stuff, I am more scared of a Psychic Frog than I am a Dreadhorde Arcanist, because Dreadhorde Arcanist at the end of the day is a 1/3 creature all the time. It never has flying. I can go over the top of that card. I can trade with that card in combat. Psychic Frog will fuck your day up. Like, you can be presenting lethal and then immediately go to, oh god, I can't attack anymore, into, oh no, Murktide got involved, into just dead so quickly.
Yeah, and that's going to be an interesting thing to bear out because, like Bryant was saying, like having 2 creatures on board versus a Dreadhorde Arcanist, it's like bolt, attack, rebolt. Now you don't have any blockers. That play pattern doesn't exist with Psychic Frog, but Psychic Frog with 3 cards in hand. What do you have in the format that's going to be able to tangle with that thing? And the opponent doesn't have to commit to it until you block. They could just send in the 1/2 and ask you what you want to do about that. And I have found that basically all resource dumps are worth it to get Frog into play. The Force of Willing a removal spell on turn 2 to get the Frog in. Force of Willing a daze if they daze your turn 2. Frog. Like something like that. Like these exchanges where it's like, this is a lot of cards for an early threat. Is this really going to be worth it? Or it gets bolted and you have 6 cards in hand and then they bolt it again. I'll go Hellbent. Yeah, give me that thing. That's kind of how it is. It's been playing out. So have a real plan for that. Because and another skill that's going to have to emerge is Frog versus Frog matchups. How does combat math work where we both have a Frog? Is it just whoever attacks first wins? Or is there like anything clever to do with like double blocks? Like I have 2 Frogs, you have 1. But if you're attacking, can I even like win with a double block? Is there anything to be done here? I think the player with more cards in hand just wins that combat, and you have to take your medicine. And then, yeah, like if they have the first Frog, but then you end up with 2 Frogs, and they've been steadily drawing a card, at one point do you leave a Frog back versus drawing 2 cards on offense? And at some point it's just lethal too, because you take like 1 or 2 from the Frog for a while, then you realize they have 8 cards in hand, and it's a 10 ball if you don't block. This card is very complicated, and I'm not saying it's too good, but I am saying it's very good.
I do have an observation. So if we think a little bit further back to the expressive iteration era of Legacy, and I know it's going to bring up bad memories for Phil. Phil, I am sorry. But if you think about that time period, we had Ragavan, we had Delver, we had Dragon's Reach Channeler, and we had Murktide Regent. So if you look at those creatures, they're split between blue and red. If we look at what could possibly be post Grief, we have Delver Secrets, Dragon's Reach Channeler, Psychic Frog, Murktide Regent. 3 of the 4 of these are blue. We could go back to the era where expressive iteration was legal and people were playing Pyroblast as an answer to these large creatures, because if you look at this deck, Pyroblast is very good against it, and it cleanly removes Psychic Frog / Murktide Regent. Delver Secrets too, obviously. But you're sort of pressured into playing red. I could see Painter being a very good choice in this metagame. And I think having Pyroblast be good isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it's sort of been trending down for a while now with Grief, because it just doesn't do enough versus the Grief deck. And I know that people didn't like the main deck Pyroblast format, but if the format is about Psychic Frog and Murktide Regent, I think it's a very reasonable main deck card.
All right, I've got 2 notes here. One is a quick one, and then I'm going to go back to Painter. I have put Abrupt Decay into Legacy decks for the first time in eons in respect of Psychic Frog. 2, on the Painter note, Painter's really fucking good against Eldrazi, because once your Painter Servant is out, your Eldrazi cease to be like colorless and devoid. So your Eye of Ugin, for example, is no longer going to make your Eldrazi cost less. And that is a painful lesson to learn.
Eldrazi Temple also specifies colorless, I believe. I'm looking it up to make sure I'm not lying, but I'm pretty sure it shuts down basically all that stuff.
Yeah, no, that is colorless as well.
Yeah, like all of the things, Wizards, R&D, like despite Eldrazi being busted and requiring bans in Modern, and then we might be coming back, and they've been great their entire existence. They actually do have a couple little backstops like that are really clever, and you realize what Wizards was up to when they specifically worded cards like Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple to do exactly what they do. And Painter, like Phil said, I had that moment too where I was playing against Painter and I was just like, yeah, that's fine. I'll just, cast my Thought-Knot Seer next turn, and then realize that my Eldrazi Temple Eye of Ugin was not even close to casting Thought-Knot Seer. I had 1 mana available. for a 4-drop.
Yeah, I could definitely see Painter being one of the best decks post Grief ban, like based on it being good against Eldrazi, good against Frog/Murktide. I'm not like, if you're someone that's looking to invest into a legacy deck, I also think Painter is probably a pretty reasonable choice.
Yeah, it's like City of Traders, and usually not even that many of them are the reserve list cards that are played in Painter. And while City, normally when I'm coaching people who want to get into Legacy, I encourage cross-appeal staples, like a fetch land and a dual land will be in many decks, where City of Traders won't be in that many decks, but City of Traders also costs way less than a Volcanic Island. I think you could get 2 or 3 of them for the cost of 1 Volcanic Island, if my price memory is holding right now. Like, you could build Painter for way less than the mana base of Delver.
All right, Phil, I think that we've postponed your love letter to Eldrazi long enough. You have the mic.
All right, so let's do it. So we are talking about this deck because it is roughly 9% of the metagame. A quick note here, something is wrong with MTG Goldfish's data. It is just not displaying Eldrazi as a deck at all. So just kind of be wary of MTG Goldfish data in the short to medium term until like Eldrazi starts popping up.
I'd like to tack on a quick note here. In the league I was playing earlier, I tried looking up the newer Cloudpost decks that feature Sowing Mycospawn and the Planar Genesis, I believe it's called, the land that is all types, and then it runs 1 Urza's Tower. Those decks are also not on MTG Goldfish for some reason. If you look at Cloudpost, it just doesn't count those decks.
Planar Nexus.
There we are.
All right. So outside of the lands in this deck is almost entirely Modern Horizons 3 cards backed up by older broken lands. Turns out Soul Lands plus pushed creatures is good. We've never seen that in Legacy before, so this is new. The deck's core is very different from the Eldrazi deck of the past. So the core of this deck right now is Glaring Fleshraker, Sowing Mycospawn, Thought-Knot Seer, Kozilek's Command, Lotus Petal, and about 25 lands. There is no consensus build of this deck at this time, so expect a lot of variation. When we say Eldrazi, we are not necessarily referring to like one monolith deck. You should expect to see some number of Chalice of the Void, Null Drifter, It That Heralds the End, Devourer of Destiny, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, Eldrazi Repurposer, Wastegate Battlemage, Eldrazi Linebreaker, Mox Diamond, and I saw Oblivion Sower today for the first time in like 5 years.
Oh, the G. I love Oblivion Sower. Welcome back.
So Chalice of the Void is very common in this deck, but it is not necessary. Some of them just drop it for more aggro elements. Sometimes people will like play some Vexing Baubles in there. I saw one list that was just going ham and playing 4 copies of Noxious Revival, which raised an eyebrow from me.
What were they doing with it? Was it just Wasteland Insurance, or like literally what? Explain it to me, Phil.
I can only speculate. So Noxious Revival can target both players, right?
Yeah, so there is like some passive scam hate, I guess.
So like you pull a creature out of the graveyard in response to a reanimation spell. Your opponent fetches, you just go like, hey, why don't you draw that fetch again? Attack you for 10. Like, I guess you take them off of outs that way. You get more shots at replaying your Glaring Fleshraker or whatever card is critical. That's one of those, like, I don't know what sauce they were cooking with, but it was tasty apparently, because it was like a challenge top 8 or something like that. So it was real enough.
I was not prepared when I sat down for this podcast to hear the Noxious Revival is Time Walk in Legacy argument, but here we are.
Yeah.
Scorching take. I'm excited to see how that develops.
Notably here, I did not read off Reality Smasher on this list of cards that are seeing play. Reality Smasher.
Yeah, Phil, Eldrazi Linebreaker is just better.
I fucking love Eldrazi Linebreaker. That card is so goddamn good.
It's a 3 mana creature that does the same thing, but better.
It's true. And the wild part is like a huge portion of these Eldrazi decks aren't playing it. Like I combed through the results in preparation for this episode, and a ton of them are playing Eldrazi Repurposer instead, which just like makes an Eldrazi spawn when it ETBs and dies. I'm not excited about that one.
Yeah, I had to ask Jeeves that one. I wasn't sure what it did.
Yeah. I think the rationale for playing Eldrazi Repurposer is that you get to stay closer to green and your creatures are easier to cast. You could like throw a basic forest into the deck, a Yavimaya into the deck, a Gaia's Cradle into the deck, and that smooths out a higher percentage of your draws. But Eldrazi Linebreaker plus Glaring Fleshraker just fucks. I am so down for that.
Yeah, Phil, I remember in our MH3 preview episode, you were pretty hyped about Glaring Fleshraker. And then you and I played some games in early access, and you played a lot of that card, and you were kind of lower on it than you were initially. I'm glad the boy found a home, because that card is so cool, and it's really good.
Yeah, I have had swinging evaluations of Kozilek's Command and Glaring Fleshraker. My initial leagues with Kozilek's Command were very bad, and as I see that card more and more, it's just like, what doesn't it do? It kind of covers everything.
Yeah, that card's really, really good. And I actually played Eldrazi recently on the channel, and I was just obsessed with Kozilek's Command the whole time. And somebody in my comments was like, ThrabenU is low on Kozilek's Command. What do you think about that? I was like, well, he's probably going to come around to it, would be my guess. Another cool thing that I saw, obviously in Vintage, because Sensei's Divining Top doesn't exist in our format, but 2 tops plus Fleshraker is GG.
Oh, yeah.
You flip the top, cast it, get the mana, ping you. Flip the top, cast it, get the mana, ping you. I just like saw that come together in real time in front of me, and I was like, oh, I guess I need to force a negation this against Sensei top, or I just lose. This is terrifying. So that's the thing that exists if you want to play some Vintage.
Oh, I guess I should share this because this is deeply of interest to Phil. However, probably not to many of our podcast listeners. I was playing a Modern League. My opponent plays turn 1 Gravecrawler. And I was like, okay, sure, whatever, weirdo. They turn to play the zombie that says whenever another zombie enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. It's a black-white zombie for 2. And I'm like, okay, tribal zombies? I died the next turn.
Oh, I know you did.
So they played the new zombie wizard that says sacrifice a creature, create a treasure.
Oh, shit. Yeah.
Which is an infinite loop with Gravecrawler. And I was just like, what just happened to me? And I was like, this has Phil written all over it. And that infinite loop thing reminded me. So Phil, there's a Modern deck with your name on it, full of bad creatures.
Yeah, Jimmy's rustled. I'm in. You know what's not in, though? Eldrazi Mimic.
Ooh.
That is another card that has been power crept out of the deck, sort of surprisingly. Early builds had them, and they're just disappearing. What that means is that in most of these builds, your curve is kind of starting at 3 mana. And so your Lotus Petals are incredibly good and not super replaceable. Usually these Stompy decks tend to have Chrome Mox. That doesn't work with the Void cards. So if you don't have it that heralds the end, or maybe Chalice of the Void in your hand, you're just playing a land and passing a lot of the time, unless you are on the Mox Diamond builds.
Well, Phil, that makes a lot of sense to me. Lotus Petal is there to support Eldrazi Linebreaker, but also Eldrazi Repurposer at providing those off colors. It's like another Cavern of Souls type effect, so that makes a lot of sense. And then Eldrazi Mimic doesn't have Reality Smasher or, I'm blanking on the name, the X Eldrazi that was blank.
Endless One.
There we go. Thank you, Brian. But without having those gigantic Eldrazi in the deck, Eldrazi Mimic becomes a lot weaker because it's just like another 2/2 or 3/2. So it's just a little underwhelming. So it just, like, I've already said this, but it makes sense that it's gone. Sorry for being so rambly.
Yeah, so we already talked about this in the pre-show, as our supporters know. And if you listening want to get this conversation, you can join that. But we talked about weirdos in the YouTube comments and how people just say stuff without thinking at all. And I recently, when I played Eldrazi, someone was in the comments that's like, any deck with Eye of Ugin needs Eldrazi Mimic. I was like, okay, did you look at this deck? That, like, cut 4 cards for Eldrazi Mimic right now that make this deck better. I'll wait. They're just not there. That card doesn't hold up. It doesn't get big enough. When you're clapping for 10 on turn 2 off a Reality Smasher, or 15 if you had 2 Mimics, like, that's just a different deck from a different era. We're doing a different thing now. And Eldrazi Mimic is just kind of embarrassing. I'd be pretty stoked if an Eldrazi opponent played that card instead of one of the exciting new ones from MH3 against me.
One of the things I really like about this deck is that so many of the Eldrazi shift to having on-cast abilities. And one of the things that we've been talking about for a huge portion of the episode is just like how good Psychic Frog is. Well, Wastscape Battle Mage is a way to basically uncounterably bounce that Psychic Frog out of play. Devourer of Destiny, 7 mana to cast, so it's a tall order, but like once you get there, like cast trigger, exile Psychic Frog, it doesn't matter if my 7 mana spell gets dazed. And the tempo aspect of this deck is such where if you take something out of play for one turn, your opponent might just die.
Right, and if what's being removed from play is something like an Atraxa or Archon of Cruelty that required reanimation to set up in the first place, or a Psychic Frog where 3 cards were discarded at some point to get it bigger than your Eldrazi, or like a Murktide Regent if we're talking about the future, or playing in Grixis Delver, or a Phyrexian Dreadnought, as we just discussed, though that's a deck that can answer a cast trigger. But a lot of the things we talked about as being good in this metagame, just booping it out of play is not just a matter of recasting it and it's back.
There's also the fact that these being cast triggers aren't weak to Grief Your Threat Reanimate. Like, you'll get a larger creature, but the Sowing Mycospawn trigger of searching your deck for a land isn't going to come back and punish you. So enters the battlefield, or enters, I guess, if you're weird and up with new trends, versus cast triggers are actually pretty meaningful here.
So let's talk about Sowing Mycospawn. I am super hot on this card, and like the more I see it in play, the more that I love it. So the most common play pattern that you are going to see from this is like this gets cast probably on turn 3, getting a wasteland and setting you back 1 land. And then another turn or 2 later, it's Sowing Mycospawn kicked, on cast, exile 1 of your lands, get another wasteland, take you down 2 lands. So this can very much obliterate your ability to crawl back into the game with higher CMC cards. Like if you have, some sort of Supreme Verdict style card that you're waiting to cast, sometimes the answer is just like, no, you don't ever get to do that. And recent technology has put in a Maze of Ith into the deck to kind of help wall things like Psychic Frog, and a Gaia's Cradle, because it turns out that if you have a bunch of Eldrazi spawn from a Glaring Fleshraker, a Gaia's Cradle lets you do silly things beyond what the deck is normally doing, which is already a little silly. I think I recorded a match earlier today where I died from 18 after my opponent did something like Fleshraker pass turn, Sowing Mycospawn, trigger, get a Cradle, tap the Cradle for a bunch of mana, play another Fleshraker, Kozilek's Command, and it was just like over.
Yeah, the ability to put a tutor engine into the Eldrazi deck is pretty insane, and even just at baseline of Sowing Mycospawn always gets Wasteland, that card was already really good. And as people figure out that they can also just build these kind of green-white depths or Maverick-esque toolboxes of cool things to do, like Knight of the Reliquary has been a eternal playable card since its printing, and Sowing Mycospawn, I know it's kind of a lateral comparison. It's not really obvious, but think about that the way you think about Knight of the Reliquary and the way that that card affects a game. It's a body that also tutors whatever you need right now to solve a problem, if you have chosen to include a land in your deck that solves that problem. And we have decade plus, 15, 20 years now of Knight of the Reliquary decks existing, and getting those, look at those old lists, find those one of Gaia's Cradles in Maverick from the olden days, find Karakas, find Maze of Ith, and that the Talon Gates of whatever, the new one from MH3 that phases out a creature when it comes into play.
Madara.
Yeah, the Nicol Bolas House, like you could tutor that shit, clear a blocker and get in, or flicker out one of your own creatures. I don't know, like there's a lot of dope lands in Magic the Gathering, and thinking about Sowing Mycospawn as just a wasteland machine, already pretty insane. And then if we get creative, we could find really crazy stuff to do with it.
So speaking of crazy stuff, as time goes on, I am more and more afraid of the highest potential upside turns of Glaring Fleshraker. and I'm still kind of mentally working through, like, how much do I respect that card? Like, do I play my 2 mana critical to my deck play on turn 2, or do I do the 1 mana, remove that card, and take no chances that I die? I'm still kind of working that out, but I have died from a lot of positions that I felt I was incredibly favored in due to the power of Glaring Fleshraker.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a hybrid comp for that in Magic's history. Like, it's pretty clearly a comparison to like a Young Pyromancer or Monastery Mentor in terms of the longer it's in play, the worse it is for you. But what can we hybridize that with it also like just kills you or makes mana or like I don't even know. This is a mix of a bunch of upsides all on one very cheap card, and that cheap card enables bigger cards like that. It's a mana engine and a like permanent engine and a damage output engine. There's just so much going on there that I think like cards in hand is probably my gate for how much I respect the Fleshraker. Like if my opponent kept 7 and turn 1's that thing, and if it's 5 cards in their hand, or I guess it would be 4, I'm probably pretty scared of it. If they have 1 card in hand, maybe I chill. If they mulligan a few times, can I wasteland them underneath the thing? I don't know, but that card is really scary.
One thing's for sure, we're going to get enough reps to answer that question. This deck is going to be incredibly popular. Like it is fast, it is flexible, it has some great things going for it, and it is maybe the only deck that is like actively gaining large metagame percentages in the face of Riskaminator.
Like we talked about, it is structurally set up to check the boxes that we like to check versus Riskaminator. And once Riskaminator is gone, there's not even the ability to go over the top of it with an Archon of Cruelty anymore. It's just going to be something in the format. And I have been growing my fondness for Consigned to Memory, another card from Modern Horizons 3, 1 blue instant, counter target triggered ability or colorless spell, and you can replicate it for 1 colorless. So this is a hyper clean answer to those cast triggers and the body coming behind it for 2 mana. You also just get to counter stuff like Chalice of the Void, and Thassa's Oracle, and a Grief Trigger, even a Bowmaster ETB. Like I've been finding a lot of love for Consigned to Memory lately, and we'll just stay on top of that as this format develops.